Hi everyone, I'm Richard, developer evangelist here at Shippo. Today we're going to be going over the Shippo object architecture, a little bit about setting up your account in Shippo, and then we're going to be going through a basic shipment creation flow, which is going to involve address verification, getting real-time rates, creating labels, and then we're going to leave plenty of time at the end for questions and answers if you have any. So with that, let's go ahead and dig right into it. So object architecture at Shippo. We want to cover some of the concepts and how Shippo handles creating shipments, addresses, parcels. We always refer to things as objects. Some objects are composed of other objects, and some are generated by objects. And so we want to just sort of dig into a few specific ones. There are quite a few different types of objects at Shippo, but I want to focus on those related to creating shipments and creating labels. So right here we have what our basic flow looks like. So you can see that we have the two address objects and a parcel object that's used to create a shipment, and that's what a shipment's composed of at the basic level. There's few other objects that a shipment can contain, but that is what a shipment is basically made of, and then that's what will create the rates, which will actually exist in that shipment as an array of different rate objects. And those rate objects are actually created by a carrier object, which isn't shown here because we didn't really want to focus on that. But each one of those rates comes from one of those carrier objects. Then you use that rate object in order to create a transaction. Then the transaction triggers the creation of a track object, and the track object will repeatedly update the transaction with information about the status of the shipment. Just to actually, let's go back really quick because I just want to mention that some of the other object types that aren't listed here is our carrier object, our manifest object, our batch object, and our customs object. Those are used for a few more advanced things that you can do in Shippo, but we'll still be covering a little bit on the carrier object later. So I wanted to focus on the shipment object because this is the most complex of all the objects that we have here at Shippo. The most basic part is two address objects. You have your address to and your address from, and then your parcels object, which is where you're actually defining the dimensions and weight of your shipment. After you actually do that in the creation step, you return back what would look like this, but this is like a very abstract version of that. So you're going to actually get a bunch of rate objects in your rates field, and that's what you're going to be using for choosing which rate you want to use or creating the label. Another concept that I wanted to cover is async versus sync. This is pretty important to understand before you actually start programming against our API because we actually do everything asynchronously by default. So you actually see that we turn rates and labels asynchronously unless you specify that you want it synchronously. So on all the different objects, you can actually specify this. You'll see some examples later where we actually show where you can specify async false in case you want it back. If you're not familiar with what async and synchronous means, synchronous will basically mean that we won't return a response until we have created the object that you've requested. Asynchronous means that we will return a response and indicate that it's queued, but that you're going to need to query back later to find out when it's been completed. Almost all objects can be created synchronously. There's a few exceptions like manifest or batch, which are just not intended to be done synchronously. But pretty much every other object you can do synchronously if you want to ensure that you're getting all of the information back when you want it created. So with all of those concepts covered, we can actually go into a little bit on the Shippo API setup. A lot of these things are actually optional with the exception of the first step, which we'll show is signing up. So you can just go to goshippo.com/register and actually sign up for your Shippo account. Once you're there, you can actually go to the API section, which you can see at app.goshippo.com/API. This is where you're actually going to be able to get your API keys. On the left, you'll usually find your live token, and on the right, you find your test token. It's pretty important to understand the difference between these two because a live token will only have access to live data and test token will only have access to test data. So if you're ever trying to interchange these two tokens and you're wondering why you're not seeing certain carriers or certain addresses, that's because each token has access to different types of data. So you want to keep these separate and ensure that you use your test token for all of your testing and ensuring that your integrations are working, and then your live token when you're actually going into production. I also wanted to cover the carriers that you'd like to use. So the reason that this part is optional is because we provide USPS and DHL Express out of the box. So you actually get a master account with USPS where you can get discounted rates. That will be for any shipment that's a US origin going within the United States or internationally. But we have an alternative of DHL Express. If you want to do a shipment from US to somewhere internationally, you can use DHL Express. We offer discounted rates for both of them. So there's nothing additional that you need to do, but if you have your own carrier accounts, you can actually add those in either manually or programmatically. I do want to touch on test mode because this is one place where a lot of developers tend to get tripped up initially. When you add your carrier account, you can actually specify on that carrier account whether you want test mode activated. If you activate test mode, that carrier account will only be accessible by your test API key. This is particularly useful in certain carriers because they might have testing specific credentials that you need to plug in. And so you need to specify that those credentials are test mode only because you can't pull any kind of live rates from them. So some carriers actually require that. And we automatically direct all those test requests to their test environments for you. Giving an example of like how you can actually create your carrier account object. This shows how you can do it programmatically. It's pretty useful because you can also add in metadata for each one of your carrier accounts if you want to specify that, you know, this is belonging to a certain customer, or you just want to be sure that like this is marked as like a test account. You can add it in this way. You can use any of our client libraries to add in carrier accounts. And we have this detailed in our documentation for you. The last part I want to touch on when we come to webhooks is, or come to setting up your account, is the webhooks. So we have 5 different event types that you can actually track in Shippo. That's going to be your transaction created, transaction updated, batch created, batch purchase, and track updated. The most important one to actually take note of here is the track updated, because you can use that to actually track any shipment that you created in Shippo, or if you actually posted some tracking numbers to Shippo, you can actually get real-time update, well, near real-time updates on them. About every 2 hours, we'll be able to push out new found updates for any of the tracks that you've added to us. All Shippo labels that you create within Shippo will automatically have those tracking updates sent to your the webhook that you have registered there. So that's the transaction created and transaction updated actually can be fairly useful for if you want to understand when somebody's creating a transaction in your account, which is essentially a label, but they didn't do it via the API, they did it through our dashboard. That's useful for just identifying when somebody manually created a shipment in your account. And then I do want to kind of mention a few tools here that are really useful for when you do your webhook development. One of them is being request bin. I use it all the time in order to just plug in request bin in order to see what payloads look like. You can go there, it's free to actually just get a URL, plug it in, and then start seeing requests being pushed through when you're testing. And then to go a little bit further, you can use ngrok to expose your local dev environment so that you can put a URL in there that's directly communicating with whatever you're developing locally. And that's really useful for when you actually want to connect it into your own business logic to ensure that it's working. So now that we have all of the setup stuff out of the way, we can actually go into a basic shipment creation flow. So I want to emphasize that this isn't necessarily how everyone will want to be able to be creating their shipping process, but it helps a lot in understanding how all of the different Shippo objects can be put together to create shipments, get rates, and get labels, and then also to be able to do more advanced things in Shippo, like something like single call label generation. It's better to understand how the basic flow works before you go and create something in a single call, because if you go straight into single call and you run into errors, it might be more difficult to understand why those errors are occurring. So at a basic level, we're going to go through validating an address or addresses, then using those addresses to create a shipment, and then selecting a rate from the shipment that we created, and then using that to create a label. The reason I want to emphasize this flow is because certain stages will actually prevent you from running into issues later on. So if you validate an address ahead of time, then create your shipment, you know that you have rates that you can use to create a label. If you're not wanting to actually create a label in the end, you don't necessarily need to validate an address. You can actually just provide us with a minimum amount of address information and then use that to get quotes. Quotes can't be used to purchase labels, but they can be used to show rates on a website if that's what you're wanting to do. So validating an address is fairly simple since you're just providing this address information and then telling us to validate it for you. So we'll show what an example looks like. On the left, you actually have a request and what it looks like. We just simplified this into JSON to make it easy to understand. On the right, you'll actually see what the response is when you create that address. A lot of benefits to validating addresses is that you can prevent failed deliveries and prevent charges due to address corrections. It's pretty important to ensure that your shipment is actually going to get to its location, because if they end up sending the package back because it was undeliverable or they corrected the address and it was wrong, you end up having to pay for shipping twice. So it's better to just do this up front. It also fits in really well with when you're gathering information from your user for where they want to be shipping their package to. You can actually use this in that step to validate what they're giving you and then provide it back to them. So we'll actually be giving you a corrected address back with more information. And it might not necessarily match up to exactly what you provided in the first place. So you always want to be able to provide that back to the user to say, does this look right? And if it doesn't, then you can actually allow them to validate a different address. Or you can then just use that address and, like, after they confirm it, to go into the step of creating the rates. So the basic fields that you have to provide in order to validate an address is you want to provide the name, street one, city, state, zip, phone, which is required for some carriers, and email. The email is not quite as important. You can provide your own company email, but it is useful because some carriers are actually going to require you to have that. A few other fields that we have available, but I just didn't highlight here because they're not always required, is street number, street 2, and street 3, and those should be used whenever it's relevant. Street 3 is generally used on international, and street 2 is like when you have something like a suite number or a unit number. And then in order to actually validate the address after you give us all that information, you just need to provide one additional field, which is the validate key. You can actually see the validate key over here highlighted in green, and you just have to specify that it's true. You can also validate an address that you already exist using our URLs, and you can actually find that in our documentation on address validation. I prefer actually using this method for validating addresses because you don't have to create the address first. You can actually just validate it up front. And then you get your validated address back here on the right. So we'll actually look at a response. And so you can see that we have a full response on the right, but I've highlighted over here on the left the important fields to be aware of. We have our object ID. That's going to be like object IDs work like pointers in Shippo, and that's going to point to this specific object. So you can use object IDs in place of full objects because that ID essentially acts as a pointer. So whenever you provide it, we actually know, let's just go look up that specific object in our system and use that for this field. So you don't actually have to provide the full address object whenever you're using it to create shipments later. The field highlighted in green here is the is complete field. This is necessary for understanding if you can use this address to successfully create a label. If we have enough information to actually use this to ship it somewhere, then you'll have your is complete is true. Below that, we'll actually have your validation results. So in this instance, we actually had a perfectly good shippable address. If you ever had an address that was completely unusable, we couldn't find something in our database, you'll have is valid be false, and you'll have a series of messages in this array that will actually display to you what needs to be corrected or what went wrong. if there's an event where we provided back a valid address, but something was changed, you'll also find is valid is true, but then you'll find messages in the messages array. So it's always worth checking there to ensure that if there's something that was changed, that you can actually make sure to surface that information back to your user when you're doing the correction. And then in the red, we have our corrected address. So in the event that what I provided initially wasn't quite matching, you could actually even see there that we have suite, I think was changed to STE instead of a number. So you can see that we've already corrected pieces of this address and it's still completely valid. So it's always worth making sure that the input that you initially received matches the input that we give back so that you can surface that back to your user and say, does this look correct and is this okay? Sorry, I think we have a question on global address verification. So we will be actually offering the ability to validate addresses. So currently in Shippo, we have the ability to validate all US addresses. We provide that for free. We will be providing the ability to do global address verification for non-US addresses for 6 cents per inquiry. And that'll be useful because not many places are able to offer international address validation, and international shipments tend to be more expensive. So it's very useful to understand ahead of time that your package is actually going to get to where it needs to go. The process here on doing a global address verification is exactly the same. The only difference is going to be that you're going to be providing a different country. Another thing, sorry, that ends up covering almost everything that we have for address verification. So now that we have addresses that we can verify, we can actually go into creating a shipment. So here we have the basics of creating a shipment. You can see here that I actually plugged in address IDs since I already went through the process of going through the verification for those addresses. We can just use those address object IDs as pointers to the objects rather than providing them completely inline. We've color highlighted these two to line up. So you can see on the right, that's what it would be like if we provided the full address inline. And then on the left is where we're using the object ID in place of it. It's always better to use the address object ID, particularly when you're using validation, because when you validate the address, you understand that you know that you have a good address to use. In the parcels, you can actually do the same thing. We have a parcels endpoint for creating parcels. That's where you have your weight, your length, your width, and your height. If you're always using shipments of the same dimension and weight, you can just go ahead and create a parcel on the parcels endpoint and then use the object ID. I usually prefer to provide my parcels inline because it's always changing. So it's just trying to take user input and plug it in here. The parcels key is actually entirely necessary because for parcels, we're actually defining what the weight and dimensions are. And that's the most important piece of information other than the addresses for determining how much your shipment's going to cost. Because a lot of carriers do zone-based shipping and it's also determined by weight. And so we need to know this up front. So you can't not provide it. I've actually had quite a few developers who wanted to be able to avoid having to provide the parcel dimensions, but unfortunately, carriers need to know this in order to provide you a rate back. The other thing to note about the parcels object there is that we also have parcel templates. This is pretty much used for specific service levels. So like USPS flat rate, they require special packaging and have certain dimensions and weight restrictions. So that's why we don't automatically return those kinds of rates. You do need to use the parcel templates, and you can find those in our documentation under the references. There's also another field that I omitted here that's we'll be going over a little bit later at the very end. There's a shipment extra key, which actually has like an extras object. That's really useful for doing certain services like adding signatures, doing insurance, and also if you had like something like dry ice or alcohol that you're wanting to ship, that's the place where you can actually specify that you're having something unique about the shipment that you're creating and adding that information there so that you understand that you want certain rates that are eligible for that special service. So after this, we can actually look at what the shipment object looks like in the response. On the left, we have a truncated version of the shipment object. I truncated it because we will usually provide the addresses completely in line with the parcels and the address return. So you can see in the green, we've highlighted the rate objects array. This is going to be an array of all the available rates that you've requested. On the right, you can actually see we pulled out one of those rate objects, and we highlighted in blue what the actual costs are. One thing to note here is that you'll see that the origin currency is displayed. So what you see in the amount and the currency, that's actually determined by where the shipment is shipping from. And then we actually localize that rate for the destination. So in the event that you're doing an international shipment from the US to the UK, you'll actually see the amount local that would be in British pounds. So you can actually understand, like, this is what you can show to your end users so they know that what they're actually paying in the currency of where they are. So now that we understand how to create the shipment, we want to dig into how we actually go about selecting the rates. So for the rates that we have, we can actually take a look at one of our rate objects. Again, I'm highlighting the object ID because this is going to be important later when we're creating a transaction. So you can see that in green there. One way that we can select our rates from the rates array is we can use these attributes. So Shippo will actually pre-calculate certain tags. These work like enums, and we have 3 different tags right now. There's fastest, cheapest, and best value. Fastest is going to be the least amount of estimated days for a shipment. So sometimes there might be more than one. But you can actually see that, you know, if a shipment is like 1 day and another one's 2 days, we're going to tag the one that's 1 estimated day as the fastest. Cheapest is going to be the one that's the least cost. So if you don't care about how fast your shipment is getting to its destination, you just care about what the bottom line is, then you can use the cheapest attribute in order to filter that one out. Best value is a little bit unique. It's actually a combination of these two. So you're going to have like your combination of fastest and cheapest. If your cheapest one also happens to be the least amount of days, then you're actually going to find the best value tag there. I also wanted to make an emphasis on the estimated days here. So we actually recently changed this field to be from days to estimated days because we wanted to clarify that even though some service levels might have a guarantee on how soon a package would get to its destination, we can't make that guarantee on their behalf. So we wanted to provide an estimated amount of days for when your packages will be arriving. So those are the different ways that you can actually select which rate it is that you're wanting to use. So now we can actually go into creating a label. So creating a label is actually really easy with the process that we've decided to go with. There are a few other ways like single call label generation, which we can cover at the end. This I find to be the easiest because we already selected a rate. We have a rate object ID, and then we have several other optional fields that we can use for tracking our label, and then also specifying what file format we actually want returned. And then we can also see that the async false is here because in this instance, we want a label returned to us when we've requested it. So in the label file type, we've selected PDF 4x6. That'll cover half of an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper for those of us in the US. And then the metadata, we actually wanted to track this over to a customer. So we wanted to make sure that customer 2175 has this associated with them. And so that's the most basic way to create a label. We'll actually just take a quick look at the response. So the part that we've highlighted here in green is the label URL. That is what you're actually going to use for downloading and printing out your label. In addition to that, just above that, you can also see we have like a tracking URL provider if you wanted to look at the tracking information. And then you'll also see just above that the tracking number and tracking status. That's more relevant when you're looking at our webhooks, because if you want to continually track updates, you can actually use the track updated webhook in order to see what the current status is of your object, but if you ever query back on this transaction object, you'll actually see whatever the most current tracking status is for that. So in this instance, you can actually see that it's unknown because we just created it. It will transition from unknown to in transit once it's actually scanned in by USPS. Although in this instance, it'll never happen because it's a test label. So that covers all of label creation. I'm going to leave this here on advanced features and shipping extras because it looks like we have a few questions. One of our first questions is, does Shippo have plans to introduce an API call that can automatically identify a carrier based on analyzing the tracking number? So we don't actually have this at the moment. It's actually a very tricky thing to, in order to be able to identify, because there's some instances where you might have a package that the tracking number looks like it's a USPS package. And technically it eventually will be, but it might actually have been created by DHL e-commerce. So you're only getting a limited snapshot of the journey of that package. And in order to track that fully, you would actually have to have the DHL e-commerce tracking number and query against DHL e-commerce. So it's kind of tricky because some tracking numbers don't have specific patterns, and some carriers actually have almost no pattern. I've seen certain regional carriers who actually allow you to sort of pick your own sort of tracking number that you want to be able to use for a shipment. Others require account credentials. So it's something that we would like to be able to see, but it is a much more difficult thing to be able to implement. So we haven't really prioritized that yet. We will eventually have very soon have the ability to do test tracking. So when you're actually building out your webhooks, you can actually provide some of our Shippo identified test tracking numbers if you're wanting to track on certain statuses. But beyond that, you actually do need to currently know your carrier and the tracking number in order to get your tracking information. Another question, you said international address validation is coming. I thought it was available. When will it be available, and will it return long lat? That's actually a really great question. So we have the plan, I think in next quarter, to be releasing global address validation for everyone. It's currently actually in a beta right now. So we have a few companies whitelisted while we're testing to ensure that we have everything working how we want it to before we release it to everyone. As for the long lat, we will be providing a certain level of specificity on an address, but it is dependent on the data that we have available and what was provided when you verify that address. So we have messages that will clarify whether or not it's at a block level, a building level. I think those are two different levels. There might be even like a larger level because some regions it's very difficult to actually determine where your address is. So yeah, that's actually a really great question. Another question we have is, can the dimensions and weight for a parcel be considered maximum? And can the label be used for smaller packages? So it is something that you can do. I mean, a carrier, very rarely would I think a carrier would ever ding you for overpaying for your label. So as long as if your package was smaller than specified, I think in the actual dimensions, there might be a little bit of gray area there. But in terms of weight, if it weighs less than you specified, I don't see there generally ever being any kind of a problem there. So if you always wanted to sort of overestimate just to be safe, if like you're taking user data on what they're shipping and you don't really know what it is because you don't have control over that piece, I would say that adding a little bit of wiggle room there by overestimating slightly is probably a safe bet because then you don't get a surcharge. One thing that we're actually going to be working on doing is actually servicing surcharges back to our users so that in the event that they have a package that doesn't match what it says and our carrier is coming back to us and saying, hey, this USPS package that you're doing in first class mail, actually you should probably have been bumped up to priority, or maybe it's a priority mail package that was 3 pounds, but it's actually 5 pounds. We want to make sure that we are servicing those kinds of additional charges if they get found and providing those back to you so you understand when you're not actually in compliance with that carrier. Another great question that we have, Some rates have descriptions like will take between 2 and 6 days. Any chance you will expose this range in the data? That is something that we actually are working on. It's not as generally available, but we are actually looking at tracking data now, so that we can actually eventually start working on finding our own estimations as to when a package will get to a certain destination. We do have the privilege of getting to see many packages going to many different locations from zone to zone and of different weights through different carriers. So what we want to be able to eventually do is provide predictive understanding of when a package actually gets to its destination, not just when your carrier is reporting it'll get there. But that is a really good question. We do want to have our own way to surface that data, but currently we're kind of beholden to when a carrier says a package will get to a certain destination. One of the best examples of this is like first class mail. I think a lot of the time it specifies 5 days, but in many instances gets there in less than 5 days. So like we've had one person who messaged us saying that they use first class mail because they get such a great amount of savings with it. And most of their packages get from West Coast to East Coast in 3 days. So this is the kind of information we want to eventually be able to make available to you so you can make better decisions about what service levels you're actually using. We have one more question here. What is, I was just wondering how it differs if I set address validation to true. Will it then create a label without going through validation? I'm kind of a little bit confused on the question. So if you set address validation to true and you were, say, creating your shipment inline, you will still get rates back to you, but you will still also have information in the validation results key of your address object. The reason that you don't, I don't really recommend doing inline address verification when creating a shipment is although that you can get rates returned back to you with the information that you provided, if there's something wrong with the address that you've put in there and its validity, you can't actually use that rate to go and create a shipment or to end up actually creating the label. So that's why I actually recommend if you can in your current architecture, do the address verification up front, it's gonna save you time later because otherwise you're going to eventually have to recreate that shipment. And then it's actually causing just as many calls as if you had verified the address ahead of time. The other thing is if you know that you have a valid address and our address validator for some reason says that the address that was provided isn't valid, say it's like a very, very new development or address in a house that was just built. We have the ability for you to actually bypass address verification. That's something that you can see here in our Shipment Extras object. You actually specify that on a key. You would do that in the shipment creation process, so it still doesn't save you unless you want to do the address verification, then you bypass address validation. Then when you go to create a label, we won't do our automatic address verification. And I think I actually failed to mention that every time you create a label, we actually automatically do an address verification for you for US addresses. So we will automatically try to ensure that like the address you provided is a deliverable address. So in order to bypass that process, you actually need to specify it ahead of time when creating the shipment. If we are always using, okay, we have another question here on return addresses. It says, if we are always using the same return address, can I create the object once and reference that single object for all shipments we make through API using object ID over and over again? Yes, you most certainly can. And so even though I only showed the address to and the address from fields when creating a shipment in Shippo, there is another key there for address return. And you can actually specify, your address return to a specific object ID. There's another feature in the settings where you can actually specify an address and what you want your address return to be. I would always actually recommend though that you explicitly just provide that address object ID when you do the shipment creation so that you always know that your returns address is being provided for all of your labels. So if anything goes wrong with it, it needs to be returned to sender, that it's going back to the place that you want it to. We have another question on packing service provider. We're using a packing service provider. Can we, through our iOS app, use API to create the entire shipping record, but not print it and have that done already for the shipper? If yet, and then I guess this is a multi-part question. So if yes, then how do we let them know what to look up? Do we send them to a transaction ID on our packing slip? Can we do the transaction ID in a barcode so that they can just scan it and then the transaction will appear on their dedicated Shippo terminal? What it kind of sounds like you're describing here for an entire shipping record is manifests. If you're actually trying to create an entire like scan form or manifest for your carrier to scan in so that they can receive all of your packages at the same time, we definitely have that feature. You can see it's mentioned here on manifest. I'll actually go into our docs really quick so I can actually show you what some of this looks like. We have tutorials on all these different pieces. You can see in the advanced section, we actually have a whole thing on our manifest. The thing that I do want to clarify though is like when you're providing something back to your shipping carrier, it's not the transaction ID, but it would actually be the tracking number. That's what they actually use for tracking their shipments in their system, and that's the unique identifier between you and the carrier. The transaction ID doesn't actually show up for them. That's a Shippo only identifier for a specific shipment. But if you're wanting to provide like several labels back to your shipper, then you would just use the label URL for all of your transactions. I see we have another question on, do you offer anything regarding booking pickups at carrier? We do not have a way for you to actually schedule a pickup with specific carriers. I don't think all carriers even actually have an API for that. So if you have a regularly scheduled pickup with your carrier, then any package that you can create can just be handed off to your carrier in that regularly scheduled pickup. Outside of that, if you're creating a shipment, say with FedEx, and you don't have a regular FedEx guy coming up, you do need to go to their website and schedule a pickup with them if you're not wanting to drop it off at one of their locations. Let's see, one more question. Would it be realistic to get rates for a user on a list of say 40 items and 40 different sellers at shipping locations? What I'm asking if this can be done every time a user looks at a page on our marketplace. That's an interesting question because if you had 40 different items for 40 different sellers and shipping locations, you could request those in like a batch and have those processed. It would take a little bit longer than something that I think would be useful if somebody's like looking at a page of 40 items, you want to pull 40 rates. You'd have to pre-fetch the rates ahead of time before that page is actually loaded. So if somebody's visiting your site, you have a reasonable understanding of where their location is. And then you're wanting to like have them click into and load on a page with 40 different items. If you already know the parcel dimensions and weight and 2 different zones, you can definitely actually pull in all of those different rates, or you can progressively pull them in as they're scrolling through the page. It's kind of dependent on how your website is set up. But that is kind of a tricky one because 40 different items would require 40 different labels and a quote for a lot of different dimensions. So you would have to do 40 separate calls with Shippo in order to pull all of those. It's a little bit different if you were, say, a single provider who had 40 different carrier accounts and you wanted to pull 40 different rates for all of those different carrier accounts. You can do that in a single call. So that's pretty simple and straightforward. So I actually wanted to go through a couple of things here. This might spark a few other questions, but I wanted to touch on the advanced features and shipping extras. So over here, the reason I didn't go over these in this because this is just a getting started, understanding the architecture and the overall thought process of how to implement Shippo's API. One thing that a lot of developers are really drawn to is single call label generation because you get to create a label in a single call, and minimizing the amount of calls that you have does sound ideal. The reason that I want to cover all these other concepts first is because when you actually do this single call, we're going to be creating all of these objects on your behalf. So we're actually creating the shipment object, we're creating the address objects, the parcels, and then we're using that to just jump straight to returning a label to you. The reason that this can't always be useful is because you need to know ahead of time which carrier account you're using and what service level you want. So if you're not trying to return a specific rate back, it can be really, really useful, especially if you're processing a bunch of different shipments and you always know the addresses and the parcels and the carrier account and the service levels. If like you have a negotiated service agreement, then you can actually use that. We have another question that just came in as a result of this. If I have my own agreement with a carrier, can I use it for shipping? I just provide credentials in the UI. You most definitely can. So I can actually show you quickly here where you add your carrier account. If you already have an NSA with a specific carrier, you can just plug in your credentials through here or through the UI. The UI is pretty easy if you're not having to do it dynamically, and I would actually recommend that. Certain carriers are actually going to require you to go into the UI if you want to have your negotiated rates displayed to you. So if you want your UPS, this is very specific to UPS. If you want to have your negotiated rates shown to you, you can add in your credentials initially, and you will always be billed the correct amount for whatever services you're using you have negotiated. But in order to have the correct rates displayed, you have to go through a full registration process. This is a part of a requirement by UPS to ensure that you have authorized us on your behalf to pull these rates back to you. It involves like having your a billing invoice and like certain pieces of information available to plug in through the registration process. If you don't do that whole process, we will actually provide an error in the messages field back to you that will say that these rates may not match what has been negotiated or is billed on your invoice in your account. So one other thing I actually wanted to touch on here in the extra services, because it's something that we actually provide to you without having to do anything else, and that's insurance. You can actually specify on the insurance, on the extras field for insurance. So we actually offer insurance for all of our carriers, and we do this through our partner Shipsurance. So for 1% of the declared value, we can actually insure the entire shipment for you. It's pretty simple, and you can do it for any shipment. It's pretty useful, especially around the holiday season when you want to ensure that things of high value make it to their destination, or if something gets damaged, that you can actually make sure that you can file a claim if something happens. And I think we had a couple more questions. Is there a rate limit to the number of API calls that we can do, and how is that handled? That's kind of a fun subject to go over. So we do have a rate limit in place. It's fairly generous. I would never recommend anyone trying to actually, if you anticipate that you're ever going to be butting up against that, we would love to have a conversation with you. But currently the rate limit, I think, is 100,000 requests per hour. So it's pretty generous in terms of rate limits. We do eventually plan on imposing a more conservative rate limit in the future. We haven't quite determined or nailed down what that will be, and it'll probably still fluctuate between certain users just because of the amount of volume that they're doing. Just because we want to be able to provide a very strong, reliable system, and rate limits will eventually help us in doing that, because if we have some people hitting our API more aggressively, but they're not actually using any services that we charge for, then in those instances, we want to be able to throttle that so that we can provide better service to those who are paying. An excellent question. Is there any support for batches? We do have support for doing batch shipments. Let's actually pull up the section in, oops, we actually pulled the wrong one. So we'll do batch label creation. You can get labels and shipments created in batch. The first step is you actually create the batch. And so you provide a bunch of shipments. You can provide those in an array here. And the thing that's interesting about batches though, is that if you know that you're doing a lot of shipments and you want them processed in one large group, you can actually send that all off to us. What'll happen is that I would recommend plugging in a webhook to actually track when a batch has been completed. In those instances, say you have 50 or 100 shipments that you want processed, what'll happen is that you'll send all those shipments to us. We'll go through the process of retrieving rates for each one of those for whatever carriers you've specified. And then once we're all done with that, we will send you a notification. You'll be able to say, okay, these all processed, we're good to go. And then you actually go through the process of purchasing them. When you trigger the purchase, we are then gonna go asynchronously fetch a bunch of URLs and create for the labels and create those all for you. And then you'll actually get a single PDF with all the labels for that entire batch. So it can be really useful if you're like a warehouse and you want to be able to do, say you're going to pick and pack 100 shipments right now. You can actually send those off, get all your rates that you've already specified, created, purchased, and then come back and then print them all out in one single go to slap them on packages. Outside of that, if it really does fit your business need, batches can be really useful. I generally recommend that if you don't need to use batches, don't use them. It's perfectly fine to actually do single calls and just create them on the fly and on demand. But you can find everything in the tutorial here about how to get through and create batches yourself. If you ever have any questions, you're more than happy to ask on Stack Overflow, and we can find an answer for you through there. So we have one more questions on marketplaces, and we're gonna actually have this be our last question. It says, we are a marketplace selling multiple items at a time from sellers to the buyers. We will guess on the box size, but the seller might use a completely different box size. Would it be necessary to get the correct dimensions, or can we, as asked before, state to the user that the dimensions weight just have to be inside what we estimate? So that's actually a pretty common thing that I get asked by a lot of marketplaces. We love to recommend that you actually look at the data if you have it, or you just create a way for people to enter the data and then just sort of see what's going through your system over a specified period, and then try to create different buckets of weights and dimensions, and then guide users into actually selecting those so that they can match up with certain costs that you find to be ideal for them. One customer that we work with, Mercari, they have an excellent way of doing this. You can actually see it in their application if you download it and go through the process. They actually provide a fun way of saying, like, if you're shipping an iPhone, you're gonna fit it in a small box. Or if you're doing like t-shirts or a laptop, you wanna put it in like a medium box. So you can actually create these different buckets for people to specify. And this kind of goes back to what we said earlier when we had the question on, can you like overestimate? In those instances, you can still kind of overestimate a little bit on the dimensions and the weight because it's always better than underestimating, because underestimating can lead to surcharges and additional costs that you're gonna run into. But I would always recommend that you try to create buckets that line up with something that like you've already negotiated on certain rates. Say you get a great deal on Priority Express or international shipping in these certain dimensions. You can then just sort of promote those to people to ensure that like if they choose this, they get a really great rate. If they try to do something outside of that, you can inflate the rates that you're passing on to your users in your marketplace. So let's actually go to the last slide. I'll go ahead and show us, if you guys need support, you have additional questions beyond this, you can ask all of these API related questions on Stack Overflow. I'm very active on there. So chances are you will see me responding back there if somebody else in the community doesn't get you. If you have any shipping related questions, please do visit our help center at support.goshippo.com. We have an excellent support team who can provide you the answers that you need for any shipping related questions that you have. You can also email support@goshippo.com. And our support hours are Monday through Friday, 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. Pacific time, and Saturday and Sunday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. I want to thank everyone for your time and have a great day.